Robert Breedlove is a Bitcoin educator, freedom maximalist, writer, and host of the What is Money podcast. He ties his past experience in the hedge fund world with his studies of economics and philosophy to dive deeply into the importance of money, something most of us use every day but take very little time to understand. This podcast is sponsored by me. Go to joshcherryplays.com to see what I'm up to. Robert, thank you for coming on.
Glad to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
I want to start with decentralization, and I'd like to open with this idea of, for thousands of years, people without a leader have come together and yelled, "We want a leader." And I just want to explore that a little bit with you, because amazing things have happened from that and horrible things have happened from that. And then there's a flip side where there have been, let's say, in frontier countries, there have been incredible movements of individuals who have gone to explore and then, come together occasionally to work. But most of their progress happened on an individual basis. But there seems to be these, in my mind, two areas where people find ways to move forwards. And to you, what is so interesting about the phenomenon there? And what are the values and dangers of that great noble cry of "we want a leader"?
Well, this goes pretty deep, I think. First thing I would say is that, hierarchical organization is something inherent to most social creatures. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this with lobsters. He lays out the fact that this creature that's, lobsters are very ancient. I forget the number, 300 million years old. Yeah. They've been organizing themselves in hierarchies that are based on kind of the might is right principle. So the bigger, the stronger the lobster, the more mates he has, and the higher up the hierarchy he is. And the point there, the way I view this is you have to step out of the frame of the organism and actually look at the frame of genetics. So we each, and this applies to all life forms, each of us is a genetic code inhabiting a particular vessel, which is the actual organism that we are. And that genetic code, this is DNA and RNA. You could think of it as kind of like an organic blockchain in a way. It's a deep history, a deep historical ledger of all the transactions we've made in nature over time. So all the adversity we've overcome, all the adaptations we've made, all of the struggles we've been through, right? And the culmination of what we are today is that sharpened survival strategy, right? So the code that makes you up today is the whole history of your success, your ancestors' successes and failures, right, across time that are distilled into who you are. And so in that way, you could think of genes as kind of like the master organism, right? Genes pass from generation to generation pretty much unchanged, the individual genes themselves. Now, the combination of genes within each organism changes, right? That's what sexual selection is. You get half your mom's genes, half your dad's genes. They get blended together in you. You're unique in all these specific ways. But the individual genes are, by and large, unchanged generation to generation. There's, at the edge, they mutate, but that's a very, very, very rare case. So hierarchical organization then is the genetic community trying to promote the organism to the top, which is best fit for the demands of the environment to pass on those genes. Like whatever genes are inhabiting that organism are what are most successful in the conditions inhabited by that hierarchy of organisms. So it's deep, man. This is not just oh, we humans got together in a community and we decided we need a leader. Like, this is something that is deeply innate to life itself, right? This is, you could think about hierarchical organization as an extension of that survival strategy, right? You want to promote those that have the best genes, the most fit genes for the environment to the top because it helps the group survive, right? So um it's a useful way to look at it. And I think too, when you consider that we, each of us is a survival strategy propagating through flesh, blood, and bone, it also helps you draw the connection between these extensions of our survival strategy, like tools, like hierarchy, like organization, like religion, like all of these different things are, and the biologists would call this the genotype, which is the information itself, and then the phenotype is the manifestation of the genotype. So that's your body, your flesh, your horns, maybe, or if you're a lobster, your pinchers. And then humans, we specialize actually in having extended phenotype. So we use tools more predominantly than other animals. We extend our genotype into the world in a way that most other animals don't. Some do, you know, birds build nests, beavers build dams, things like this, but humans do it in a very unique and specific way. So this cry for a leader, I think, is something very biologically innate. Um, and the struggle has been throughout human history, what does the leader report to? Right? By definition, if he's the village leader, let's say, or the tribe leader, there's no one above him. There's no human or organism above him. So, what is he? And I say he because it is typically a he. What is he beholden to? And I think humans have been really struggling to figure that out throughout history. But it seems to be like the best thing to make the leader subservient to is a principle, right? There needs to be some higher order principle which the leader is striving to embody, um, and therefore, you know, to have something beneath him. So this would be a check on his own power, his own egoic desires, or a moral code of some kind that prevents that leader from becoming tyrannical, more or less, right? And this has been something that we've tried a lot of experiments throughout history. You know, ancient, again, Jordan Peterson, he's such an influence on my thinking, but he talks about the Mesopotamian, ancient Mesopotamian society. They had Marduk was like the god that every year the leader would come out in a ceremony, and the community would basically you know, reward or punish him based on how well he embodied the principles of Marduk, which was their god. And he had a number of you know, aspects to him and virtues he was intended to embody, and they judged him based on that. So there was a kind of this bottom up balance to the top down emanation of a leader in a hierarchy. So I think that is kind of the proper balance we're trying to strike. But then the question becomes like, what is the principle, right? What is the principle where we're holding highest? And I guess the kernel here for Western civilization, at least, is that, and this is rooted in Judeo-Christian mythology, right? Like Jesus, this is one of his core messages. Um, the sovereignty of the individual is higher than the sovereignty of the state or the leader, right? So that we should respect the individual above all else. So that is kind of the principle that's at our worldview now. This is embodied in things like, you know, habeas corpus, being innocent until proven guilty, private property rights, which are this is the basis of civilization, actually, that you own yourself and that you own the things you spend your time producing or adding value to. That's the basis of Western civilization. These are all rooted in that Judeo-Christian substructure of the sovereignty of the individual is higher than the state. So I would argue that that is at least the principle on which we are intended to be organized today. Now, the implementation of that principle has skewed significantly, right? Central banking is something antithetical to this principle. The central bank, when it is printing money, it is violating the private property rights of all the citizens depending on that dollar to store its value across time. So the ebbs and flows or booms and busts of civilization, I think, have been really based on this. It's like who's the leader? By which principle are they to which principle are they beholden? How do we determine succession of leadership, right? How do we you want consistency of that principle across time, but you also want adaptivity, just like you want in the hierarchy, right? You want some rigidity to the hierarchy such that it has integrity over time, has dependability and consistency, but it also needs to be adaptive at the edges so that we can learn and improve. And there has to be this balance between fluidity and rigidity, I guess you would say, in the hierarchy itself. Same for the principle. Um, and it seems to me, and this also ties into libertarian philosophy very closely, is like when we focus on the individual is the elementary agent of human organization, right? There's not Rothbard talks a lot about this. Society is an illusion. There's no society, right? There's a collection of individuals. So, and I guess to tie that into decentralization somewhat, people have always looked for a rule set that emerges from this collective discovery process, right? It's not something that one individual just imposed on everyone else. It's a culmination of all the learnings we've had throughout history, like which rules are best to follow. And something that, the other thing about decentralization is that it means that the power within the system is not emanating from the center. So there's not a central point to control or corrupt that can hurt everything else, right? The power is as evenly distributed as possible, such that you have a balance between this this need to adapt and this need to maintain integrity. And it is in a lot of my work. I talk about money, which I think is one of the most important tools, if not the most important tool, to organizing these hierarchies beyond the Dunbar number of 150 people. And that's why gold was money, right? Gold was the OG analog decentralized money. No one could control it. No one could do anything about it. No one could increase its supply arbitrarily. So people discovered over time that this was the most decentralized monetary technology that also exhibited the properties of money to be good money. And that's why it was chosen. That's why it was selected. And yeah, that gets us to gold. And then, the struggle from there has been who can centralize and control the gold as best as possible. And like one of the Rothschilds said, he who has the gold makes the rules. It's as if gold is this base layer operating system for human action.
Could you describe briefly in what ways gold was decentralized? What made it that way?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, it was, and this is not as important, but it was naturally dispersed geographically. So this somewhat matters for gold to become adopted, just that it's in different pockets of the world, so people trade with it. But the main fact about gold that made it decentralized was that it was very resistant to discovery, to extraction, basically. No matter how much effort we allocated towards gold production, it was the commodity whose supply we could increase the least. So what this meant is that nobody could corrupt or dilute its supply. It was the most inflation resistant money in history. And that's why people naturally selected it as money. Because if you're going to park your wealth somewhere, right? You're an entrepreneur, you can store your wealth in anything, right? I can stock out I can stockpile oranges, I could stockpile gold, I could stockpile lumber. Whatever I choose, I'm going to incur the consequences of my selection. Well, the oranges are going to rot. The lumber is going to last a little longer, but probably going to use more of it as firewood or building a house. Like it's got more of a utility demand to it, let's say. But gold was, initially was just people were attracted to it because of its ornamental purposes, right? It's just a shiny, pretty metal. And that sort of bootstraps the demand for it. Like people want it just because of its beauty initially, its luster, let's say. But then over time, they discover that that demand is the least satisfiable, right? No matter how hard you try to find more gold, you just can't. It's really rare. It's really hard to find. And it also turns out that gold offers these other properties of money, like the visibility, durability, recognizability, all of that. So that meant gold as a monetary technology was resistant to any centralized uh, control or politicization or manipulation. And so, because of its resistance to all of these things, or, basically resistance to human action and opinion, people choose it as money because it's the most incorruptible money we ever had. And that's what humans are always looking for in money. Yeah, you want something because money is such a powerful tool. Like to be able to control it or possess it is the most powerful incentive in the world because it gives you optionality on everything the market can bear. If I have money, I can go and obtain anything that marketplace can generate, right? Food, water, shelter, yachts, whatever. Money is a call option on all of those things. It's the most powerful incentive in the world. So humans naturally want to store their wealth in a money that no one else can have an attack vector on, basically. So that's the importance of decentralization overall. And that's why gold was chosen as decentralized money.
Does it make sense to say that decision making is extremely work intensive and centralization makes that easier
Mm-hmm.
with the danger of corruption? And then decentralization has historically been very difficult, but easier to maintain integrity on.
You're spot on. So decision making is cognitively expensive, just even at the individual level, right? You're going to decide what you're going to do with your day, right? There's an expense associated with that. That expense explodes when you try to coordinate a group of people. If you've ever been to a music festival with more than 10 people and you're like, which way should we go? Like everyone's kind of fighting over which direction to go and people are saying hi to other people. The point is the more people you add to that network, the more expensive it becomes to coordinate that network. So if you centralize decision making in the hands of a few, right, just one leader, you can move much more quickly and less expensively, right? There's a lessened cognitive load to guide the group. The problem with that is that you're now beholden to that individual, right? And that individual is holding the reins to a lot of power. And as Lord Acton taught us, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I think often about this old saying when it comes to centralization and decentralization. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So with a centralized model, you can move across space very quickly, right? And you can think about this a number of ways. One, if you're a totalitarian and you just own a whole economy, I can just pass a law or send a signal to my followers that everyone start to mobilize the army. Everyone start building tanks. Everyone start building planes, right? I can very quickly get people to do what I want them to do. But staying adhering to that singular unified plan over time is much more difficult because all of those agents have their own interests. So I can get people to do something very quickly across space, but it doesn't It's not sustainable across time. People are divergent from the plan across time, and this sort of tears the thing apart. If, on the other hand, you're decentralized, right, and everyone's a sovereign individual, no one can pass that order to get everyone to do one thing all at once. So it doesn't move as quickly across space towards one objective, but it persists across time significantly better, perfectly in a way, perfectly compared to the single unified plan. So, if you want to go far, go together. It's everyone's acting in accordance with their own self-interest, sort of creates this dynamic equilibrium that causes the group to persist across time, even though they can't move super quick in any one direction. And you can see examples of this in even in modern day governance systems, where in North Korea, the leader can say to do this, build missiles, and they'll build missiles very quickly. Whereas in the US, we have much more democratic gridlock, right? And we're trying, should we increase the budget ceiling? Should we not? There's a lot of push and pull. There's a tug of war there. Um, but to your point, that centralized decision making model, although it gives you cognitive expedience, it comes with the risk of corruption. Whereas the decentralized model, which is very inefficient, you could say, right? If there's a lot of energy expenditure to not move a lot, but it resists corruption because there's not any singular willpower being imposed on the others. It's a constellation of willpowers interacting. And through the same lens, you can look at money that way too. So gold was that constellation of willpowers. Everyone's kind of wrestling what's the best store of value, just coalescing around gold because it had the supply most resistant to inflation, which made the individual holder of gold most resistant to being debased or diluted. Whereas central banking would be something opposite to that. They could arbitrarily increase the supply of money, based on the decisions of really just a handful of people, um, at the expense of everyone else. And so that can be used to, you can print a bunch of money and pump it into the economy real fast and get everything moving really quickly. But what does this do? Is it's very much like a stimulant that you're hurting the organism, which in this case is the productive economy. You're jacking them up on this stimulant of artificial liquidity, but it causes them to become exhausted and really injured in the long run, right? And that's what in the economic sense, we'd call this the misallocation of capital. So all of this artificial liquidity causes people to engage in a bunch of projects that cannot be executed profitably or successfully. So you get this misallocation of capital, and you get this boom and bust business cycle that we're all accustomed to. Whereas if you're on something more like a gold standard, it doesn't move as fast. The economy is not as stimulated in the short run, but it can last and be much more sustainable over the long run. So there is this fundamental trade-off between centralization and decentralization, related to decision making, that you so brilliantly observed.
So how does Bitcoin bridge that gap logistically? How does it utilize the efficient decision making of centralized systems? How does it tap in to that efficiency while maintaining integrity? And is that the correct framework to go from? Does that sound like a good way to describe what gap needs to be bridged?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is to understand the conditions Bitcoin has been released into and is intended to solve, right? And this was encoded in the Genesis block. Chancellor on the cusp of second bailout of bank, Satoshi specifically designed Bitcoin to be an alternative to centrally planned money, which is that if you want to go fast, go alone, right? We're going by one plan. We don't have a say in the plan. There's I think the number of Federal Reserve employees are 20,000. I think their board of governors is 7. So 7 humans deciding the money supply
Oof,
for I think 5 billion roughly people
that's
use dollars.
disturbing.
Very disturbing, very centralized. Um, and clearly, as we outlined earlier, the risk of corruption becomes even greater the more you centralize. So uh, Hayek wrote a lot about this. The nature of power actually changes the more you concentrate it. It becomes more noxious, more corrupting, because you have more power over more people. So your own incentives and perceptions become more distorted by virtue of being in that position of power. So you can only imagine how corrupt I would argue that the 7 people that control the money of 5 billion people actually are. I don't care if you put Mother Teresa in that seat, it's going to have an impact on her psyche and ability to maintain integrity. So Bitcoin is released as a technology antithetical to the centralization of central banking. And it is it's so through that centralization, the attack vector and the pain point is that central banks keep expanding the money supply. So they keep printing more money, which is to say they're confiscating wealth from the productive economy and then allocating it out according to their own political whims, right? That's what Bitcoin's trying to solve. Bitcoin is a decentralized network where every node operator, which is to say someone that has downloaded a copy of Bitcoin software, is choosing which rule set to run for themselves. So it's maximizing the sovereignty of the individual node operator. And then there's the mining network behind it, which is competing in this capitalistic game to solve a puzzle and be rewarded new Bitcoin. And it's this interlocking set of incentives and we'll call it a symmetry of governance, I guess, that adheres the system around the rules that are optimized for holders. So it's money that cannot be inflated. There's zero unexpected inflation, which is another way to say that is there's no counterfeiting. Inflation and counterfeiting are the same thing. It's just a legal discernment, whether you could say that inflation is legalized counterfeiting, counterfeiting is criminalized inflation. They're the same thing. It's just the legal distinction between the two. Bitcoin has no unexpected inflation, 0%. Only the holder of a private key can execute a transaction. Transactions cannot be stopped. They cannot be reversed. They cannot be censored. So it is the opposite of this top-down command and control centralized central banking model where a few dictate their willpower onto the many. This is a bottom-up network where the individual selects the rule set, selects. You can literally, by the way, you can go and run your own Bitcoin version and say there's, instead of 21 million Bitcoin, we're going to have 50 million Bitcoin. That's fine. You can do that. But it won't matter because that would be against your own self-interest. That would be against the self-interest of other node operators. And so you would basically be forking yourself off of the network. And it's kind of the analogy here is you can fork the rules of the game of chess, but nobody's going to play with you, right? So the rules have already been, and I guess this is where maybe the centralization balances into it, because when Bitcoin was released initially, it was purely centralized.
Yeah.
It was just one idea in one guy's head, Satoshi, and he released it to the world and said, hey, here are the rules. Here's the game. Here's how mining works. And he just let the project organically bootstrap itself into existence, into this monetization process. So upon its release, it's very centralized, but over time, as more people play the game and that shelling point of voluntarily adopted rules becomes more widely selected by more market participants, it approaches decentralization, right? This is not something that's black or white. It's a probabilistic curve, right? You're moving from something that's very centralized to something that's very decentralized. And it's not something you can just implement technologically. It's something that has to occur through an organic, idiosyncratic sequence of events, right? This is what we call path dependence typically. And so we could say that the balance there was Satoshi selecting this rule set that's optimized for holders. That was the centralized aspect of Bitcoin. He opened it up to the world. Hundreds of millions of people have now adopted it. It's very decentralized. Everyone acting in their own, voluntarily acting in their own self-interest now preserves the integrity of this network. And so another aspect of this, so base layer, base chain Bitcoin, very decentralized. This is when you hear a lot about its cost of transactions. Oh, Bitcoin will never scale. It only does 15 transactions per second, or whatever the number is. Okay, that's by design. Bitcoin needs to be inefficient at the base layer in terms of transaction throughput to preserve decentralization. So every one of these transactions that goes out needs to be checked by all the other nodes on the network, right? That's a very energy intensive process to make sure no one is lying, right? Every computer is checking every other computer's work effectively. So it's self-auditing every 10 minutes. That inefficiency or that energy expenditure is what preserves the integrity of its supply. That's what guarantees its fixed supply. That's the only way in the known universe to guarantee the supply of an asset. To fix the supply of an asset, the only way to do it is through proof of work mining. So you get what critics would call this inefficient monetary base layer, and they'll compare it to Visa or they'll cite whatever statistic. But what you're citing there is a fully decentralized database to a centralized database. If I'm Visa, I only need to update one database. Of course, it's more energy efficient. What's the problem with that? Like we touched on earlier, it's centralization. You now have to trust Visa, right? Visa can do whatever they want. They own the ledger basically. Whereas in Bitcoin, nobody owns the ledger. It's everyone checking everyone's work. So Bitcoin, though, being a purely digital money, can actually increase, it can take on a little more centralization at higher layers to increase its transaction throughput. So this is what the Lightning Network would be, right? We would trade off some of this trust minimization at the base layer. And instead of not, basically just trusting the Bitcoin core code and the incentives and self-interest of the network participants, you can choose to instead abstract up to the Lightning Network, where you'll actually trust the integrity of a smart contract and the interlinkages of these smart contracts in the Lightning Network. And you'll be able to transact at much higher throughput, but you will be sacrificing a little bit of that trust minimization. So you get a little bit more centralization in Lightning Network, and you're giving up some of this assurance of incorruptibility, if you will, but you're getting many orders of magnitude more transactions per second. So Bitcoin very delicately navigates this balance between centralization and decentralization. And I guess, this all can maybe sound a bit heady to people. Perhaps the best analogy for Bitcoin at the base layer is that it's an extension of the internet itself. So we're all familiar with HTTP, TCP, IP. These are all internet protocols that have become decentralized over time. They've just ossified as the standard, if you will. And that's how the internet has actually evolved, is in these layers of protocols for moving information. Bitcoin is just the latest layer in that internet protocol suite that lets us move economic value in a similarly permissionless way.
The use of energy to maintain integrity makes a lot of sense in my mind from the physics concept of the idea that everything over time moves towards disorder, right? I can't remember which law that is.
Second law.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
And for anybody that ever has trouble making sense of what that is, I usually use the analogy of cats. I would say that you need to have like the second law of physics in the encyclopedia and then a photograph of a cat right beside it. It's like if you leave a cat in a room, everything just slowly disintegrates in that room. And that is like a fundamental law of nature, is that that's the way all things behave over time. So it makes a ton of sense that you would need to put energy in to battle that particular law, to
Mhm.
maintain integrity in some way.
Yes.
It's it's interesting, um, when we initially opened, you brought up uh, quite quickly the idea of the centralized leaders need to have a check on them, and that check being sometimes the concept of God, and or other times just an overarching principle. And it's really interesting because the next thing that the very next thing that I had on my list on my notes uh, referred to both those concepts.
Hmm.
And I'm not claiming that I think I know that this is the principle. But the next thing that I wanted to bring up was the concept of truth. And when I think about the idea of not telling the truth, the mental framework that I'm now holding in my mind, this is the thought exercise that I go through in my own head, is that choosing to not tell the truth, choosing to lie, in my perspective, is sort of the act of playing God,
Hmm.
because you're choosing to shape the universe without someone else's knowledge or consent, with
Mm.
the assumption that you know better how it would work out.
Hmm.
And there are, in some Eastern schools of thought, the concept of we are all God, right? There that does exist as I think a very fascinating framework that can be very helpful. But in this particular instance, I think it's very a very good idea to ask the question like, okay, maybe you're a maybe you are part God, maybe you are God, maybe you are made in the image of God, depending on which school of thought. But in this particular instance, are you qualified to play God? And that's just been the mental exercise that I've been playing with the concept of a lie, is like it's playing God, and are you qualified to do such a thing? And maybe there are times when you can argue that that is the case, but I think it really sort of it caricatures the idea so that you can go, oh, maybe this is a pretty terrifying thing to play with. Maybe it's a really terrifying thing. So one, I'm curious of your perspective on that view, and two, what are your thoughts on the importance of truth?
Yeah, I mean, humans have been arguing about this and trying to properly define this for as long as we have existed, I think, or at least as long as we've been speaking and thinking. So, and I don't claim to be if, hmm, let me say this first. I think the truth, the capital T truth, which I'm going to struggle to put into words, the ultimate reality, right? The fundamental, ultimate nature of everything, if you will,
The thing that's so true that we can't talk about it.
is beyond words. Exactly. It is ineffable. Um, I
Yes.
think Terence McKenna said that all language is a lie, right?
Mm.
We're trapped within language. We think in it, we talk about it. Um, and you could say in another way that language clearly is finite, right? We're using we are finite creatures, but it seems like, and the intuition here, and this is where we kind of lose language, is that the totality of all that is, the capital T truth, is infinite,
Mhm.
right? This would be
Yes.
the domain of eternity beyond space and time. There is something there that we cannot describe. Words cannot pierce there. Logic cannot go there. Mathematics even cannot penetrate this domain. And this is why I think it's related to the answers to all the great questions being paradox, right? So we hit the edge of logic, which is it's all we've got, it's all
Yeah.
we've got as finite beings to try and deal with this infinite territory, and we can just never map it, right? And we have to accept that. We need to accept that limitation and understand that everything we're talking about, there's something beneath it that we'll never be able to describe. And one of my favorite quotes on this, I think sums it up really nicely, is the map is not the territory,
Yes.
right? We're constantly trying to map reality through language, through thinking, through organization, et cetera, but we can never do it perfectly, again, capital T truth being this infinitely dynamic, ineffable, uh, constantly in flux environment that just cannot it fully resist encapsulation in words. You cannot capture it and describe it and isolate it. So it's a lot, but I think to accept that is really important. It's gives you humility as well, right? It's like you can't people that think you're going to get the whole idea of God or something, like figure it all out and then be done. I think that's just a futile pursuit.
Yeah.
So just let go of that. Um, so one of the definitions of God that I really like, and this goes back to the second law of thermodynamics. So everything in the universe tends towards greater disorder, which is to say that it becomes more entropic. Entropy as a measure of disorderliness increases in every closed system over time. This is a this is by the way, this is so important to reality. Every physical process we can observe is symmetrical. You cannot tell if it's you could run it forwards and backwards, rewind and fast forward, and you couldn't tell which direction time was. The only exception to this is entropy. Entropy is how we define the flow of time. So the entire universe tends towards greater entropy, but life, consciousness, which is a self-organizing autopoietic process, experiences the flow of time. This is just kind of my theory, because we are anti-entropic. We go against entropy. We literally so the whole universe is becoming more chaotic. We convert chaos into order. And I think that conversion of chaos into order is our experience of time, actually.
And the breakdown of that all around us is how we hold a perspective on everything. We utilize it as a framework,
Yes.
mapping that out. That's our conception of time.
Yeah, and this is the ancient idea in Genesis, right? That the force that confronts the chaos of nature and converts it into good, useful, habitable order is God.
Mm.
God is the anti-entropic principle that propagates through all life. Um, as G.K. Chesterton brilliantly said, I may be paraphrasing this slightly, but he said, "A dead thing can go with the stream, only a living thing can swim against it." There's something very unique about life. And it's not only that we're self organizing, you could say a tornado is self organizing, right? It doesn't mean it's alive necessarily, but a tornado will veer towards a place that will dissipate it, right? It'll veer into a mountain and dissipate itself. Whereas life tends to seek out conditions that optimize its ongoing existence, right? We'll seek out food and shelter, and we'll adapt our strategy and all of these things. So this seems to me to be very deeply related to what we are. There's one other aspect of this that's very interesting. So maybe one, and this is just a visualization that I have, that life, which is animated by God, this principle, this anti-entropic principle, is walking into it's that force that goes into the headwinds of entropy, right? The flow of entropy is like the feeling of that entropy, that breeze on our face, I think is the experience of time in a way. Because again, time can only be defined by the flow of entropy, nothing else. That's very important. Also, information is the resolution of entropy. So when you don't know something, there's just a spectrum of possibility, but then you observe it and it actualizes. You've turned chaos into order. That conversion of chaos into order is information. So when you reduce the entropy of an environment, you increase the information. So that's the actual measure of pulling uncertainty into certainty or actualizing potentiality into reality. That's information. So this experience of time, it's very fundamental to life. The fact that human beings are information foragers, right? We're confronting the chaos of nature, converting it into good and useful order. We do that through information gathering. We encode that information into our genetic code and we pass it down over time. So we are kind of this information propagating across time, this information wave. Um, I don't, it's very fascinating to think about all those things. And so you could say that anti-entropic principle, that is God, it is something that is by definition timeless, right? It's not something that degrades over time. There seems to be this force of life, this force of self-directed self-organization that contradicts entropy that persists over time, right? It transcends time in a lot of ways. And the language gets murky here, but bear with me. So my thought there is that the anti-entropic principle that is transcendent to time is best embodied by the principles of existence that transcend time. So, like freedom, love, truth, all of these things that we have a deep ontological sense of, very very deep connection to, but when you try to precisely describe them or pin them down, just like that capital T truth, it kind of escapes you. It's not ever quite doable. You can sort of directionally say this is what it is or what it's like, but you can never just pin it down and objectively define any of these deep principles. So I kind of consider God as I don't know if it's the generator or the confluence of these principles. Like if you mix together freedom, truth, love, there's a number of other things there, compassion, grace, you go on, joy. If you mix all of these together, then I feel like it starts to feel like God, like that's kind of what pushes us forward in life, maybe. But so just to focus on truth, and as you said, you're playing God when you tell a lie. I've heard it described this way, that when you tell a lie, you're forking reality, right? So here's what happened. Here's the blockchain of reality, if you will, right? What
And
did happen?
just to add to the idea of that, maybe in the concept of truth being God, you could say playing a false God, maybe
Yeah.
in the context of
Yeah.
what I had brought up.
Playing God, by the way, you're playing a game you can't win because you're a finite being, right? If you think you're
Correct.
playing
Yes.
God, you're imitating something that you're trying to map a territory which you can never map. Right. So I would agree with you, but I would say that it's inherent to the concept of playing God is a false imitation. None of
Yes.
us.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
Losing game.
Yes. Yes. And so when you tell a lie, you create a little fork in reality. And you create a fork because you have to sustain that lie will inevitably force you to create more lies. Right. So some simple example, a girl asks you out at work and you say, oh no, I can't go with you to dinner tonight, I'm going out with my friends to do something else. And then next week she finds out, oh, hey, I talked to your friends and you didn't do that something else. So why didn't we go to dinner? And you're like, oh, well, actually, I had to do the thing with my family so whatever. And then you go to the company holiday get together, and she talks to your family and she finds out you didn't actually do the thing with them. And so you're like, oh, so it just happened. And if anyone, which everyone has told a lie at some point in their life, I think everyone's probably experienced some version of this, right? You tell, even if it's a white lie, it can snowball, right? You've created
And
this.
it's way more likely than you would expect, that snowball. Like there's a weird um it just those snowballs occur more often than you ever predict.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, it starts to seem like there's synchronicity working against you,
Yeah.
perhaps. Um, and I think, again, this is where for the longest time I was this kind of like rational atheist, reading astrophysics, and I thought space and time was just so fundamental and that's all there is. But I think this is actually, it's where we start to lose language, but we can still experience what it is, right? We're talking about these principles, freedom, truth, love, that are somehow connected to God. I think this is kind of the shining through of metaphysical principles into reality, if you will. So I think the moral fabric of reality is the deepest reality, the reality of value, of quality. It's got a number of names, but none of the names do it justice effectively. And that space and time is really just a second layer or a higher order layer. I don't know what layer necessarily. And so when you lie, when you violate these moral principles, like, it is going to be rectified. You have twisted the fabric of reality, right? It's like taking a stone to the top of the mountain. Like, it will come back down, right? Um, and I think this is what a lot of the religions and wisdom traditions speak to, is that very fact that there is a moral dimension to reality that is more fundamental than anything you can empirically observe. Nothing that your senses can take in a moment, right? We can't directly perceive the moral dimension. We can experience it over time ontologically, but you can't observe it. We can't isolate it in a laboratory and say, there's the moral fabric of reality. But I think it's more real than space and time. And I think it was, I forget who said it. Maybe it was Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn said that every man is a center of the universe. So this starts to point towards this idea that we are each an inflection of God, right? We are each made in the image of this creative principle or force or intelligence or creator, if you're so inclined. And um, in fact, our highest calling in life is to create, frankly, right? That's sort of what you want to do, is to, how did I hear this? But the meaning of life, or the purpose of life, is to discover your gift. The meaning of life is to share it with the world, right? That's kind of like the most fulfilling type of life you could imagine. And this
Which is
is,
sorry, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, this is what we get in the market, free market economy, by the way, right? We are cooperating together in a way that increases wealth the most, or to say it differently, we satisfy the most wants. So we each are reducing, by focusing on our own gifts where meaning leads us, we're able to create the most wealth in the world, which gives us the most freedom to pursue what's meaningful to us, um, and embody that. So I just think of work as kind of this secular pattern of worship in a way, right? We're actually working to create in the same way that we are created by this principle.
The reason why I got excited was because there's an interesting um thing about what you said about the idea of you know, creating being a fundamental to humanity is, uh, that also is a godlike trait, and that
Mm,
seems like a way of playing God that is a winning game.
mhm,
Maybe because the act of creation is a finite act, right? You do it and then you're done. I don't know. I'm just playing with the idea here, but it's interesting to me that it seems like maybe there's a way to play that game, and maybe there's a way to play that game badly.
mm,
Um, you as you were talking about um establishing order inside of chaos, and that being an act of truth and a fundamentally human thing to do. I had like a collage, a series of shots of like every superhero movie in my head as you were talking. Is it like Wonder Woman, The Flash, Thor, Iron Man, like whatever. And in each one, there is a shot of not necessarily an explosion, but some outward force, wind, dust, fire, everything moving outwards. And there is the main character with a shield or, just themselves pushing forwards
mm.
into that outward force. And there is something there that like fundamentally resonates with us.
Yeah, yeah. I guess these are archetypal representations, right? Um, and I'm not as well studied here, but I know Carl Jung, which I know of his work through Peterson mostly, talks a lot about this. And it's unclear whether the archetypal representations are maybe aspects of this more fundamental reality, this dimension of more morality or value or something, or in a more materialist sense, it could just be that these are patterns etched into our psyche, right? That this is the perennial experience of humanity, right? That we're, I guess, pushing back against this chaos or entropy, and that's the hero's journey is wrapped up in that and all of that, and which again, to tie it back to the market, that's what the entrepreneur is, right? Go into the chaos of the unknown with all your skin in the game, all your skin, all your capital, taking a risk on a vision of the future. You are either succeeding, right, and satisfying wants in a better, cheaper, faster way, or you're failing. And in that failure, you learn and you teach as other people observe your failure, other entrepreneurs and market actors. They, as I joked on the Lex Fridman pod, kind of half joking, other market actors are enlightened when entrepreneurs go up in flames, because like I see that strategy did not work, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I open an Italian food restaurant on this block in New York City and it goes bankrupt. No one's going to open an Italian food restaurant there for a little while. It's just one micro example, and you could apply that anywhere else in the marketplace. Um, but I think here this, so we know how to play false god. You know how to lie. You know how to twist the fabric of reality in a way that will snap back in your face and hurt you, right? That's deception. That's falsehood. And I think work is the opposite of that, actually. So work,
Mm.
we're creative, right? We're using our faculties, our human faculties, our reason, our mind, our physical faculties. We're creating something, and we're led by what's meaningful to us, which is to say that, and that's a very important sense. I think it's like what is most meaningful to you is what you are equipped to do by what nature and or nurture. You have this set of skills and gifts and abilities, or maybe even just tendencies or proclivities, things that you're just into by nature, that if you pursue that path, you tend to do your best work, right? Because it's meaningful to you. You pour your blood, sweat, tears, passion into it, and therefore your best possible work is done. That's what the market enables. And the market, too, through this process of work, we're becoming more productive. So as the entrepreneurs succeed, they succeed based on how productive they are, as in they're creating greater results with the same amount of efforts. So what does this mean exactly? This means that we're transcending time. By working and accumulating capital, we are transcending time. So what's an example of this? Your aim is to go from New York to LA. You're on foot. You're pretty far in time from your goal, right? I don't know how long it takes you to walk from New York to LA, probably several months. I give you a piece of capital called a car, right? Or you work, more accurately, you work to buy a car, and you now have this piece of capital. Your aim is still to go from New York to LA. You're now much closer in time behind the wheel of a car, even though you're the same distance in space. Space has not changed at all, but you're much nearer in time to realizing your goal driving a car than you are on foot going from New York to LA, right? Take it a step further. What if you get in an airplane? Well, now you're even nearer in time to your goal, even though the space hasn't changed. So the point here is that capital, which are all the things we use, all the tools, it's a form of frozen time, right? We're spending our time to create capital, and the capital itself puts us nearer to our goals in time, despite their orientation in space. What creates capital? Work. What is capital? A tool for transcending time. What is transcendent of time? Ultimately, in eternity, God, these principles, freedom, truth, love. So I view work as this pattern of secular worship, if you will, right? It's how you best manifest yourself into the world. And it's also what contributes to, done properly, done in a way that the market values and rewards, you're increasing everyone's transcendence of time. As we increase our productivity through capital accumulation, we are becoming more timeless. And in this way, I think this is where the market, I argue this in my writing, that the market's generating these three pragmatic truths. And we can distinguish the pragmatic truth from the capital T truth we said at the beginning that I can't put words to as ineffable. The pragmatic truth is maybe the small cousin of capital T truth that we can actually deal with in the real world. And the simple example of this would be if I have a map and it gets me from New York to LA, for instance, successfully, is that because the map was true or because the map was useful? Right? It becomes very difficult in pragmatic spatio-temporal reality to disentangle that which is true from that which is useful. So the market generates, I argue, three forms of pragmatic truth. One is the price. Price is telling you what the consensus of market actors says any one thing trades at. The second is innovation or tools. If I want to dig a hole, the truth effectively of digging holes, the thing that's most useful for me to dig holes is a shovel, right? That's the collective knowledge of entrepreneurs across history have arrived at this particular knowledge structure to which we've indexed the materials of nature to dig a hole. And then the third would be virtue, in that as we overcome the constraints of time, we're discovering these patterns of behavior that best serve our harmonious cooperation across time. Like we would say, honesty is a virtue, right? So people across time have figured out that being dishonest creates these little forks in reality that is destructive on net to our work effort. So we've discovered through free market interaction that honesty is a virtue, or that patience is a virtue, right? The more patient you are, the more roundabout we can make our production process, the more wealthy we can become. So it's this, I think the free market is sacred, basically. It's this forum of free exchange that has no involuntary compulsion, coercion, violence. people voluntarily trading with one another that surfaces truthful prices, useful tools, and the elevation of human virtue. Um, and anything that contradicts that voluntary nature of the free market is the opposite. It's destructive. And that's what the central bank is doing, by the way. When they print money, they're counterfeiting currency. What are they doing? They're distorting prices. This is a huge issue in markets today. That's why the stock market's at all-time highs, and we have 50 million people unemployed in the US. Doesn't make any sense, right? Supply and demand are no longer determining prices. It's become more a product of policy, which is a lie in and of itself. This stifles innovation. Just look at any industry that's close to the state, and you'll see how poor they innovate. Banking's a great example. And finally, I argue that it poisons moral virtue. People become more wicked and power hungry and power seeking when you have this system that can, it's not doing any work, right? The central bank is not doing any work whatsoever. It's stealing the work of others. When you print currency, you're harvesting the productive efforts of others and allocating it out arbitrarily. It's an institution of theft, and therefore it is evil by definition, right? It contradicts the good and useful order that entrepreneurs are self-sacrificing to create. And that's why I think, at least for me, I'm so passionate about Bitcoin, because we've been trying to shake off the centralization and monopolization of money since the beginning of written history, basically. And now, for the first time, we have a tool that promises to do that.
So we've spoken about centralization and decentralization. And we've spoken about truth. And you went right into the third point, which is that I wanted to bring up, which was perspective. Does it make sense to say that in our pursuit of truth, what has happened with current economic policy, with what the central banks are doing, just how we are navigating that right now? We have distorted perspective to the point that we are incapable of operating in a decentralized way, because decentralization requires some level of certainty, right? We have to have some level of integrity in order to make a decentralized decision, right? You can't go out into the frontier and not not know if random example, not know if the hunting knife that you pull out of your sheath is going to be made of rubber or not. Like that, you need very hard facts. One of my favorite philosophy books I ever read was The Discovery of Freedom by Rose Wilder Lane. And Rose Wilder Lane was the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the Little House on the Prairie books, which are just a series of children's novels. But if you pick up the subtext on it, it's fascinating, because it was generation upon generation of school teachers, right? It was every mother was a school teacher, and then and at that time, school teachers were some of the most educated people in the community, and then they took those generational school teachers and put them in the harshest conditions that were known to man at that time, the Western frontier. And then out of it came the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, Rose Wilder Lane, who then became a journalist and traveled the world, and she wrote a book about freedom. And the clarity to her speech is astonishing. And she very obviously is an independent thinker, which I would consider to be a major factor of decentralization, is this
Mhm.
independent thought.
Mhm.
And I think that the clarity is required to empower good decisions on an individual basis. So does it make sense to say that uh, these centralized acts that are happening right now in the form of money printing distorting the value of the dollar, is that just simply giving us shaky ground that disempowers any individual that wants to make an individual decision, basically?
Yeah, you are sensing something very fundamental here, and it's that fixed rules are the bedrock of peace, actually. So
Mm,
if we go back to the Darwinian perspective on DNA being a survival strategy propagating through the organism, those survival strategies orient themselves and encode themselves based on the invariance in their environment. So the obvious one for organisms on Earth, at least, is gravity, right? We all have to incorporate the invariance of gravity into our genetic code to survive. You know, the tree has to have a certain amount of tensile strength, and its branches have to go out at a certain angle, and its leaves have to have a certain fibrousness to them, all to overcome the pull of gravity, right? We as humans have to have a certain structure and balance. All of this coding is done very precisely. And if you changed the rules of gravity, right? If we increased it, decreased it, made it wobble, you know, anything, any changes to the invariance of that rule set, all of our survival strategies would be wiped out, right? You increase gravity arbitrarily to 2x, we're all dead. We're all dead. And we, as in all the living things. Maybe there's a few that would survive. You know, this is where the cockroach survival strategy would really come into play
yeah, yeah.
because they're equipped to deal with anything, right? Or, you know, what have you. Um, and also this survival strategy of our creations would suffer. Our buildings would collapse, our bridges would break, or, you know, car tires would explode. Who knows? It would just, when you disturb the fixity of rules, you are destroying the survival strategies that have been built up around them. And so in the sphere of economics, at least, right, we're all competing with one another based on certain rules. And if you want to drive people insane, just change the rules every so
Yeah,
often, right? And
yeah.
sit down at a poker table and you're playing, you're having a good night, your strategy's working, and then arbitrarily the casino decides, hey, we're going to change the hand rankings. You know, I don't know, four of a kind loses to a straight now, something like that, right? They just switch the ordering. Like, how long? And then you start to play, and then they change it again arbitrarily. It's like, you're not going to sit at that table. You're not going to keep playing that game because it doesn't make any sense, right? It's illogical. There's an arbitrariness, there's a top down twisting of the rules that's unpredictable, that's ruining the game for everyone. uh I mean, in socioeconomics, the main rule, there's a lot of rules, but the main one that we touched on at the beginning of this was, and this is something that was discovered, right? This is something that was hard fought, you know, a lot of blood spilled, a lot of failed attempts to discover, even in, and this is as recent as the 20th century, right? that sound private property rights are the main bedrock rule set for fruitful human cooperation. And as recent as the 20th century, Soviet communism, for instance, said, no, we don't need private property rights. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need, everyone serve the state, will transcend capitalism and enter the utopia. What happened? No property rights, no price signals, no allocation of capital in line with the wishes of network actors, market participants, citizens, whatever you want to call them. Mass murder by the state, starvation, bankruptcy of the Soviet Union. That's what happens when you disturb the rules, right? When you give someone the power to twist the rules and change the rules to their own benefit at the expense of all the players, the game collapses, right? And that's what we are doing when we're building civilization. We're trying to build a sustainable game that we can all play over time to hopefully pursue what's meaningful to us in a way that creates wealth for the marketplace. Incentives are aligned and we progress, right? We become more civilized. We get lower prices, we get more variety of tools that are more interesting and more useful, you know, flying cars and all this. If we could ever get rid of central banking, and we become more virtuous, right? We find more profound pragmatic truths through the free market process. But when you have the bedrock of that process broken or even violable, when property can be confiscated, when property rights are arbitrary or they're uncertain, then the whole game starts to rot from the inside. All the institutions that make up the game, all the individual survival strategies, all the players themselves become corrupt, right? Because your incentive now is to try and get in control of the rules. Because if I can get in control of the rules, I eat the perpetual free lunch, which, by the way, the second law of thermodynamics teaches us there are no free lunches in the universe. So this itself is a lie. That you try to get behind this rule set, I can control it. I now am the monopolist on money. I run the world forever. That's a lie. It may work for some time. It has worked for some time in central banking, but it is not sustainable. It destroys prices. It destroys information propagation in the economy. It destroys innovation, and it inspires moral wickedness. And that's where we're at today. This entire socioeconomic system we've built centered on central banking, which is the lie that we can just print money ad infinitum to anesthetize ourselves from any economic error, all onward into infinity, and that the shareholders of that central bank can just eat the productive surplus of the economy forever without having to do any work. That lie is imploding before our eyes. That's what's ripping society apart. And it's all, again, the printing of money, the arbitrary expansion of the money supply is a direct violation of private property rights. So you are fracturing and fissuring the basis on which we are building this whole game. And it causes the entire structure to implode. And we've known about this for a long time. This principle of inviolable property, it got slightly disturbed in the American Constitution, but in the Magna Carta, it was the human right to life, liberty, property. These are the basic tenets of morality and the basis of civilization. Property has to be inviolable. The idea has been with us for hundreds and hundreds of years, but the implementation has always been flawed. It's always been scribbled on some document that can be ignored later on. But with Bitcoin, for the first time in human history, we have a permanent implementation of inviolable property. So this is a digital bedrock, if you will, to build an actual sustainable civilization atop of. And that's why it's so damn important to teach people about this.
I have taken you over time. I want to be respectful of your time. I really enjoyed this. Um, what are the last things you'd like to say to the audience? Are there any places you'd like to send them? Anything like that?
No, I would just like to thank you, Josh. This is great. I think about these things a lot and I talk about them sometimes, but today feels like a number of these things were crystallizing for me. So I appreciate you having me on. Um, I launched the What is Money show, which is I'm trying to get people to ask themselves that question because I think that's what takes you down this rabbit hole. If you just stop and think about, money is something you use and interact with every day, you think in terms of money. It's so common, so pervasive. But if you just press pause and ask yourself, what is money? Very few of us can answer that question clearly. Um, and it's not an easy answer. It sounds like a simple question, but there's many, many answers to it. And I think that it is the leader or the rabbit that takes you down the rabbit hole. It just opens you up to all of these other perspectives on the world. And I think that if we, as is popular to say in Bitcoin circles, if we fix the money, we can fix the world. If we take corruption out of the most important tool we as humans use, which is by definition money, we can take the corruption out of ourselves. And that's it, man. I'm here to educate. So find me on Twitter or on the show.
I also would like to second that. I watched the entire, yes, I did watch actually the entire Sailor series. The What is Money podcast for sure shaped a lot of my thinking. So anybody listening, I really highly recommend it. Excellent show. Robert, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much, man. Thanks for having me.